Peace, salam, and shalom to our weekly interfaith explorations hosted by the Interfaith Center and co sponsored by the Cobb Institute in California. The Interfaith Center of Arkansas is a nonprofit organization committed to reducing fear and hatred among world religions. And our work is guided by the understanding that gaining appreciative knowledge about different religions and creating meaningful relationships with people of different faiths increases the positive attitudes towards that whole faith community. The Cobb Institute in California promotes a process relational worldview to advance wisdom, harmony, and common good. And they live out this philosophy by working to build an ecological civilization. Our special guest today is Rabbi Barry Block, and I'm really excited to have him. He's a longtime friend. So, Rabbi Block from Congregation B'nai Israel is a Houston native and graduate of Amherst College. Rabbi Block was ordained in 1991 at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, from which he also received an honorary doctorate in 2016. His latest book, the Mussar Torah Commentary, A Spiritual Path to Living a Meaningful and Ethical Life, was published in 2019 and just got highlighted as finalist in this book award that Rabbi Barry Block will be talking to us about today. I think Barry moved to Arkansas in 2013, and I have had the honor of knowing and working with Rabbi since 2014. The first time we worked together was on a workshop that we conducted on silence that Barry, Susan, and I co taught. And since then, we have worked together on several interfaith programs and initiatives. Barry has been a wonderful contributor to our work and a phenomenal supporter of interfaith vision, mission, and the movement. And I'm very, very grateful for that. I also find Rabbi Barry Block to be a social justice warrior, and you will find him as the forefronts of the social justice issues arising in Arkansas. So I thought it was befitting when I reached out to him 3 weeks ago and asked him that if he would be willing to teach about letter J for justice in spiritual alphabet. And Barry wrote back to me and said if we would consider including a new spiritual trait, T for trust in our teachings, and that's what he would like to teach about. And he specifically said that he doesn't want to talk about trusting other people, but actually trusting God in the paths of our lives and an affirmation that we are where we are because of that's where we need to be. And when I read his email, it reminded me of a spiritual and ethical value in Islam, which also starts from T, called tawakkul, T for tawakkul. It's actually a theological concept in Islam. And tawakkul means trusting in God's plan. It's also called God consciousness. And it's one of the highest virtues or highest spiritual stations in Islam. And the practitioners or practitioners of discipline start practicing on it by simply living one day at a time, not worrying about what tomorrow will bring you, simply trusting in what God has planned. Just like the birds who leave every morning their nest, go out looking for the provisions, and then they do come back every evening with those provisions. One of the scholars of Islam write that tawakkul or trust in God is like a baby which is seeking mother's breast, and the baby always finds it. So he says that a seeker of tawakkul or trust is just like that infant who trusts God will always find God. So I was really excited that Barry led us toward that concept of trusting in God's plan. And we are honored to have you here, Barry. Welcome to our class, and the mic is yours.
Thank you very much. It's so fabulous to be with all of you here today, even if we're all in our different homes. I trust, and I'll start with that word, that we can feel a sense of community by being together on the screen. So I first met Mussar, which I translate as Jewish ethical discipline, in 2011. And I began to study a number of what we call soul traits in Hebrew midot, measures of our soul in the process of what we call in Hebrew tikkun midot, or tikkun hanefesh, repairing our souls. And as I learned these different soul traits, one of them that resonated to me is in Hebrew bitachon, in English trust. Although the word bitachon might be translated a little more broadly. For example, the Ministry of Defense in Israel is the Ministry of Bitachon. So of there being a defense, there being a certainty or a sense of feeling that we can be protected. And in traditional Judaism, and in the more traditional teachings of Mussar, the notion is very much what Sophia suggests it is in Islam, which is that we ought to trust God that the outcomes that we desire will be achieved, that God will see, or at least whether or not the outcomes we desire will be achieved, that God will assure that whatever are the best outcomes for us will happen, and that God will guide our lives and the world in that way. Now, I don't know about you, but my theology doesn't quite jive with that notion. The notion that things always turn out for the best, that we should trust that God will make everything good. For example, there's a quote, there's a teaching from traditional Mussar, which is that trusting in God while taking a lot of the work on yourself is like trying to learn to swim while keeping one foot on the ground on the side of the pool. And I don't agree with that. And in fact, my Mussar teacher, Alan Marinas, doesn't quite agree with that. In fact, we teach that every single one of us has a responsibility to do our part to make the world as good as we can make it, to make our lives as good as we can make it, to do our part, and then to recognize that there's a part, a huge part, that we cannot control, and that we turn over to God. And for me, it isn't in the sense that I trust necessarily that God is going to have things turn out the way that I want them, or even in the way that's necessarily best, but that whatever the outcome is, it's going to be okay. Somehow, some which way, going to be okay. So I'd like to illustrate with some personal stories in my own life, and then talk about what we're dealing with in the world today, and how bitachon, how trust helps us to navigate our lives. So I mentioned that I met Mussar and I began teaching Mussar in 2011. And when we would talk about the midah, the measure of trust, I would often talk about a person with a terrible illness, say a person with a devastating cancer diagnosis. And does trust require that we trust God that we're going to be cured, that you're not going to die of that cancer? Well, we cannot trust in that outcome. But as a rabbi, I have been with people and walked with people through, to keep with this example, a cancer journey. And I have found that healing often can come, certainly, from being cured, from the number of years that rack up after one is cancer-free and one feels no longer under the shadow and the cloud of the cancer. But I've also found, I shouldn't say but, and I've also found that healing can come in ultimately a humble recognition that this cancer is going to mark the end of one's life, and that one can, with proper palliative care and hospice and the surrounding of family and community, family or community friends, in making that journey meaningful and positive. And so that was an example that I gave. And also, by the way, I would add, trust that whatever's going to happen after I die, and each of us with different religious traditions, or maybe even within religious traditions, probably have different views about what happens after we die. But that whatever it is, I trust I'm going to be okay, and my family's going to be okay. That's what the midah of trust is trying to teach us when we're in that kind of a situation. So, having begun to engage with Mussar in 2011, something very unwelcome and unexpected, and in fact traumatic, happened to me in 2012, which is that I lost my job. I had been a rabbi at Temple Beth El in San Antonio for 20 years. I expected to be there until I retired. I expected to be the rabbi emeritus there eventually and be buried in the cemetery there. Literally had those exact thoughts. And all of a sudden, and it really did happen rather suddenly, I was not going to be their rabbi anymore. Now, there were certain things I had done that ameliorated that situation. And it's very important whenever we talk about trust, that we recognize that we have a role in making our world okay. So for example, I had a contract that protected me. I wasn't without a livelihood, to the ability to support myself and my family for the period of time after I had lost my job until I found a new synagogue home here in Little Rock. So there were steps that I had taken to assure that I would be okay. But at a whole other level, I was very upset. I think everybody's upset when they lose their job. My kind of position was one in which, if I was going to continue in this career, which I very much wanted to do, would require me to move cities. Would I have the regard as a rabbi? There were ego issues tied up in it. I was very concerned about my family. I was going to have to move my children, who were 10 and 13 at the time that we moved. And were they going to be okay? They had always lived in their whole lives in San Antonio. Their grandparents lived, my dad lived, and his wife lived around the corner from us, and were a very important part of our lives. Was my dad and my stepmother, who had a terrible cancer diagnosis at that time. Were they going to be okay? Even as crazy as it may sound, when one has lost one's job, I was concerned about the welfare of the congregation. And I found in the teachings of Mussar the ability, not every day, and certainly not every moment, I can be a very anxious person, but I found in the grand scheme the ability to trust that some which way I would be okay, the congregation would be okay, more importantly, my family would be okay, and that there were steps I could take to assure that we would be okay, but that I would also have to let go and trust that God would be my partner in continuing, in my continuing journey. And so first, we learn that it's important to recognize that when something absolutely wonderful happens in our lives, There's a saying, Gam ze ya'avor is the Hebrew term. This too shall pass. That when the absolute apogee of our lives is in our grasp, when we're celebrating a tremendous achievement, a wonderful life cycle moment, the birth of a child, whatever it is that brings us the greatest happiness and satisfaction and contentment and reward, this too will pass. I will not be in this high moment forever. And that when we are at our low points, when it's hardest and darkest and most difficult to see a positive future, that we also affirm, Gam ze ya'avor, this too shall pass, that I will not always be in this dark place. And that's whether it's a physical illness or a mental illness, a depression, or it is a situation like a loss of a job or a family upheaval like a divorce, whatever it is, I will not always be in this dark place. Moreover, we learn that there's a next stage. Now, when one is in trauma, it does very well when one is traumatized to embrace the notion that this too will pass, that this trauma is not going to continue for my whole life. And then there's a next step that we hope to achieve, which is to say, Gam ze yehieh l'tovah, which is that even this could turn out for good. So now, of course, I'm talking about something that happened in my life that happened going on 9 years ago. And I mentioned when only a few of you were on the before 12 o'clock, that just today I was notified that the Mussar Torah Commentary that Sophia mentioned was recognized today, got noticed today that it was a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award. And so that's a big deal. It's a high moment. I know this high moment will pass. But here's the thing. I started writing for publications and doing a modest version of what one might call scholarly work when I lost my job in San Antonio. And it's increased here in Little Rock. And so what I found is that terrible upheaval in my life and in my career enabled me to broaden what it might be for me to be a rabbi. And that I found and was found by Congregation B'nai Israel in Little Rock, and found a congregation where I can be a rabbi more in my authentic self, which I don't think I even realized I couldn't in San Antonio. That I was in constant fear for 20 years of losing my job, and to feel so much more at home in the embrace of a congregation in ways that I didn't then. And so turning over some trust to God that a completely different kind of rabbi, and it's a big difference, by the way, being the senior rabbi of a congregation of 1,000 households versus being the rabbi of a congregation of 330 households. It's a very different kind of work. There's a very different kind of external ego gratification to it. And then to trust that I might find greater happiness in that different kind of a position. So that brought me great joy. The first 6 months that we lived in Little Rock were really rough. It was a tough transition for me and the congregation. It was a much, much tougher transition for my older son, who was 13 moving to a new city and having to establish himself. He has a touch of autism, and it really was extremely tough for him. And one reason I thought it was very tough, one of the reasons to which I attributed that difficulty, was that we had not been able to take a family vacation in the summer when we moved. We took like 3 days at the very beginning of the summer, went to the beach in Texas before we moved. But you know, when you come and you move to a new community, and Jewish High Holy Days are in the fall, and they were very early in the fall that year, we didn't have a chance for what we would normally take a good week-long family vacation to really be together. And I thought that was really probably a big part of the problem. And so we planned a big trip for December. Of course, we had, let's say, 2 trips worth of budget to do that. And so we planned a cruise in the Galapagos Islands. By the way, a cruise in the Galapagos Islands is not on a big fancy cruise ship. It's on a little ship, and you get to a little boat where you get to go from one island to another in very small groups, paying attention to the ecology and exploring all the different species there. So if you're coming from Little Rock, Arkansas, the way you get to the Galapagos Islands is that you fly on United Express to Houston and change planes to a big plane to Quito and go from there. And guess what? And since many of you live in Little Rock, you won't be surprised that the United Express flight to Houston was something like 5 hours late. Mechanical issues, and that doesn't happen every day. It's not that United Express is so horrible. It just, but when it happens with those little planes, it's just, that was that. And we missed our connection to Quito. And that meant the ship was going to sail without us. And before I met Mussar, and maybe before this much bigger thing had happened in my life, I would have, catastrophized and just thought this was the worst thing, and what are we ever going to do? And this was just horrible. And instead, I found myself in the position of actually being able to call my family and say, whatever happens, we're going to have a vacation. It's going to be okay. I want to emphasize that I had taken steps. I had bought the trip insurance. That turned out to be a really big deal. I had no idea how that trip insurance was going to work, but you know what I did? As we were landing in Houston, I called the nicest hotel I knew about in Houston and made a reservation for us to go and be there, because I said, we got to make ourselves a vacation in Houston, whether for the whole time or for just a couple of days, and it has to be nice, and I think the triple insurance will pay it. And so that's an example of you have to do your part, right? I had taken the trip insurance. And I had to do my part by having a positive attitude and trying to help my family have a positive attitude. Not to say, I'm sure that we'll be able eventually to get to the Galapagos Islands. It actually took us a number of days to get there. And because of the kind of cruise that it is, you can hop on the ship at various points, and we ended up with a 4-day cruise instead of a 7-day cruise, and a 4-day cruise at the end of which I could not have told you what we missed by not having the 7 days. And not only that we had some really fun times that were totally unexpected and very different and a little lower key in Houston before we went. In the lap of luxury, by the way, at this hotel that I booked to try to ameliorate the situation. And so, but it was the trust that we would be okay, that it could be okay, that got us there, that enabled us to have that positive experience in what seemed like, certainly not tragic, it was a vacation after all, but seemed like a serious bummer. So when the pandemic began in March, the first sermon that I gave And remember, take yourself back to last March. We had just to tell you about our congregation, we had a huge event for the Festival of Purim, which celebrates the events of the book of Esther, on a Tuesday night, March 10th. Huge event. Thank God it wasn't a super spreader, but that was by the grace of God. We didn't know better, right? March 10th, we didn't know better. March 12th, we knew better. We had a regularly scheduled executive committee meeting. Carol Parham, who's here with us today, was the president at the time. We made a decision we were going to have our services exclusively by live streaming that night. Congregation B'nai Israel had never live streamed before. We had zero expertise, zero equipment, zero anything to be able to do that. We decided on Thursday evening we were going to live stream on Friday night, and we live streamed on Friday night. We have a lot more expertise now about that. And we do it in a very different way than we did it in the middle of March. The first sermon that I gave during the pandemic was about bitachon, was about trusting God that we were going to be okay. Now that entails doing our part. It requires doing our part. And we all know a lot of things that we didn't know in the middle of March about what it means to do our part, right? We knew in the middle of March that we couldn't gather in large groups. We didn't know about wearing masks quite yet. We didn't know about so many things that we've learned along the way about our part. And I was very concerned about people who were going to lose their jobs. And I was very concerned about people who were going to be infected, God forbid, die. And I wasn't preaching bitachon, trust, that nobody was going to die, and that nobody was going to lose their job, that nobody was going to have a terrible financial reversal. All of that could happen. I was trying to preach a bitachon that whatever was going to happen, we were going to get through it. And I really attribute what I say about Congregation B'nai Israel during the pandemic is that we've thrived during the pandemic. And I don't mean to say that there haven't been terrible losses, people who've been ill, people who've had financial losses, lost their jobs. Thank God none of it permanent for our members. And somewhat surprisingly, and I don't mean to suggest that this couldn't change, God forbid, but we have not had members of our congregation die of COVID. We've had members whose loved ones have died. But that somehow we would get through it together. And I really attribute our thriving during this time. In other words, when I say we're thriving as a congregation, what I mean is we have a COVID response group that has said we are not getting together in person. We've had very rare, very numbers limited outside things, but I mean, we really, for all practical purposes, are not getting together in person at all. And yet we have as much programming and services as we would in normal times. And the attendance has been fabulous, and our donors have responded, and we are thriving. And I attribute that thriving to trust. To trust that we've placed in each other and in God to be with us, that we will get through this together. We're living at a time when our national life is in a great deal of upheaval. And I will confess that during those hours on January 6th, when the Capitol was occupied, while I trusted even then that the president-elect was going to be inaugurated on January 20th, I did not while the Capitol was occupied, I didn't trust that everybody was going to be okay, or that we weren't going to have a lot more armed insurrection around the country. But as time goes on, we need to do two things simultaneously. And this is where I part from, trusting in God and taking action being like swimming with your foot on the side of the pool. I don't agree with that, because we have a lot of work to do to build racial justice, to build truth in this country, to uphold just the telling of the truth. And we have to do that with the trust that together as a nation, as a community, we can overcome. Our nation has overcome worse division before, a century and a half ago. This may be the worst division we've had in a century and a half. We overcame, our nation got through that then, imperfectly, with a legacy of racial injustice that now we need to work on and get through again. And so I'll turn it over now for discussion. I want to conclude by saying that I realize that different people are going to have different theology about how much trust to place in God's action. For me, it's about trusting in God's partnership, which means, at least in part, that God inspires me and people around me and the people across this nation and around the world of goodwill to do the work that's necessary to assure that together, even in this most difficult time, we will be okay and move to a future together.
Thank you very, thank you so much for your thoughtful comments, and especially emphasizing the aspect of doing your part, because that's something I, along with many, many other Muslims, we struggle with, because putting too much trust in God, will it lead to fatalism and we won't do anything? So you give us that balance between you have to do your part. And before we open up to the whole class for discussion, there is that other side of trust that I want you to briefly touch upon. I mean, we live in this culture of self independence, where we can do everything or we can do whatever we want. Nothing is impossible for us. And this so much focus on self sufficiency, self reliance, and self independence, it's so antithetical to the concept of trust that we are talking about today. That how much of our life is our own agency and we control it, versus at what point in time we let go. So, what does your practice of Musar and trust? How do you find that balance in your own life?
Well, I am always looking for partners. And I can't think of anything that's more important in this process than to have partners to work together, to make this world better. I'm not a preacher of rugged individualism. Certainly, each of us has to do our part in our own lives to assure our own ability to feed our families, to stay safe. For example, with the pandemic, I have to take responsibility for my own health, right? I have to not, get in the car with somebody that who's not in my household. I have to not have a bunch of friends over for a Sabbath dinner or Passover. Some of that is painful, but so there is a lot of individual responsibility required. But when we talk about these larger societal issues, in fact, defeating the pandemic is kind of, the pandemic taught us something we already knew. Although you're right that the rugged individualists still don't want to learn it, which is that my failure to wear a mask harms your health. Not on Zoom, but if we're together in the grocery store, and that we are responsible for each other's well-being. And to me, that ought to be the primary lesson of the pandemic.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Actually, pandemic did highlight our interconnectedness in so many different ways. So I would like to open our discussion to the whole class now. Questions, comments, thoughts, anything you would like to share, just raise your hand and unmute yourself. Yeah.
I'll ask a question. So I grew up a Christian, and more particularly a Methodist. And I don't ever remember anybody ever telling me that everything that happened was God's plan. From the get-go, as a young boy, I was taught to believe in God and that God is love. But it in no way involved the image of a God who made everything happen. And so I'm really wondering about other people's experience. Because with Rabbi Block, I trust in God, but my trust is not that everything happens as part of a plan. It's trust in the availability of fresh possibilities, whatever happens. That's the way a loving parent is. Your parent can't make everything right, but you can kind of trust that your parent is there with you, and whatever happens, he or she will be with you and offer fresh possibilities relative to what's actually possible in the situation. I'm kind of curious about others in our group. Did others grow up to the contrary with a sense that everything happens according to a plan? Sophia, was that a Muslim perspective for you?
Very much so, actually. And I have, like I said before, I have always struggled to find the right balance between my agency and putting trust in God. And where is the balance? And I still do. But one thing I've learned is that putting the trust in God has really helped me work on and enhance two of the spiritual traits that we are supposed to work on, which is when things are not going well our way, then patience. And when we are getting the blessings that we need, then gratitude. So I think patience and gratitude have been the result of uh, the practice of trust in my life. But if you are asking me if I found that right balance, absolutely no.
Mhm.
I just like to offer an alternative, which is to say, I don't think that I was ever told, I mean, I know I was never taught, everything is happening according to God's plan. What I would suggest as an alternative is that each of us would do well to look at wherever we are in our lives as the place that we need to be right now. And that rather than than complaining. And I don't mean to say there's not a moment for that, because there is, but rather than bemoaning where we are in our lives right now, that we, a significant part of trust is to trust I am, for reasons I don't understand, in a place that I need to be right now. And the question is, what am I going to do with that? So take Joseph in the Bible, right? I mean, so he's sold into slavery. Then he gets wrongly accused of attempted rape, when in fact he's the victim of sexual harassment. And he winds up as the in the dungeon, as a slave in the dungeon, in the prison. So that's the lowest of the low. And what he asks himself, although we don't have words with which he asks himself this, but the question that he behaviorally asks himself is, how do I make the best use of my life given where I am now? And so when the Pharaoh's butler and baker come to him with their dreams that have disturbed them, he sees it as his responsibility to ease their lives, help them, tell their interpretation, do what he can where he is, making use of where he is. So that's how I think of it, as I am where I am, and I need to I need to trust that I need to be here right now, and no matter how bad the place that I am is in right now, and I need to figure out what's the best way to serve God and humanity in the place that I am right
now. Jay, I grew up in a very conservative evangelical church background, in which there was this view that everything is kind of planned out. I remember even dating as a young adult, where I was constantly asking myself, was this the woman that God had chosen for me? And so you were constantly trying to figure out what God's plan for you was. We took a scripture that, everything works together for good to those that love God. And so you were constantly trying to follow that plan. A few years ago, there was a very, very popular book called The Purpose-Driven Life. And the whole essence of that book, and it was basically the evangelical world, was that God has a single purpose for you. And, but then I also think about Rabbi Kushner in his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and the various comments that were made to him about his particular situation. Well, God has caused this because God has a higher purpose, and God, so you just must submit to this higher purpose. And it was something that he rebelled against, and of course ended up writing his book. So this is not a position that I can affirm any longer, but I certainly understand that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Jen.
I was listening to one of the Presbyterian ministers trying to tell us, the trauma that we're going through and the symptoms that we might be experiencing. And he said that the church as a body is going through this trauma too. And one of the symptoms was inactivity or lack of motivation, especially, and then he said we needed to be aware of where they are when we are asking them to do something different. And I was wondering if you had any comments on how you get people to be more active or do something within the church or outside of the church during this trauma period?
For me, it's really important to stop saying, can't wait till we're back together again. I don't mean that it's important to stop feeling that. Individuals are going to feel that. But if a leader of a congregation says that, then that reinforces a notion that we're not where we need to be right now. Okay? And what we need to do as a congregation, and speaking about the congregation I serve, but it could be any congregation, what we need to do right now is to figure out how we thrive, how we serve God and humanity in this moment, because this is the moment we are in. This is not a 1 year, period of non-existence in our lives. This is an actual year of our lives. Or maybe it's going to be a year plus of our lives. Likely it's going to be a year plus of our lives. And what's important is that we live our lives now. And yes, we may be very eager to live our lives in a different way in a year from now, but we're not there, and it isn't going to help us to it doesn't help us, by the way, to ignore the trauma, but it also doesn't help us to deepen the trauma or to assume that everybody's got the same trauma. So I mean, our MO has been to be positive but not Pollyanna, to acknowledge the pain, and to emphasize that we're continuing to live, we're continuing to worship. There's another little piece of this, which is that I, several months ago, decreed that we're not going to use the word virtual. We don't have virtual services. We don't have this today. What we're doing is not a virtual class. We are really learning together. We are really interacting together. Now, we are virtually in the same space. Okay, but there's nothing else virtually about what we're doing. There's nothing else virtual about what we're doing right now. It's real. And so to affirm the realness of what we're doing right now, whether it's worship or study or an interaction, a meeting with a social get together, it's real. And that's very important to affirm.
Thank you very much.
I do recognize that there's an added challenge when Eucharist is involved. I don't, that's not my world, so I don't know how to how to deal with that.
I guess I'm on the same teeter-totter, I guess, that you are, Sophia, between agency and faith. And what steadies it for me is what is, rather than what ought to be. So I focus on what is. And I think it starts with the morning prayer, Moda'ani, this prayer that thanks God for restoring life to us. And at that moment, I realize I'm alive. This is a gift. And I live in the companionship of the giver of that life. And I'm given this what is, not what ought to be. So it stops the teeter-totter for an instant. It's not that 2 steps forward. I'm not going to again have that agency and faith debate, but that's maybe just how we walk the world. The cliche is 1 step at a time, but it's one companion step at a time. I think I'm talking about in the presence of that presence that is never absent from my life. Maybe.
Can I jump in?
Yes, go ahead, Dan.
I was fascinated with Jay raising the experience of having been raised with a belief, and it caused me to ask myself, how was I raised around this? And I realized that the first thing is we don't know what God has in mind. The Creator is an unknowable essence, and all we can know is what He's revealed to us. But what we're also taught is the plan of God is not an individualized thing. It's a plan for humanity and for the planet. And He's created spiritual laws and established divine principles and guided us to adopt values, and then opened a channel for us to receive guidance through prayer and meditation that enables us to ask questions about what is the best use of my day to day. And then consider the values, the principles, what we know about laws, and ask, how does this affect what I'm about to do? And that's my navigation. And about the problem of balance, I agree with Sophia and Carol. I think I found a balance, and then somebody moves the fulcrum and you got to find it all over again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. It is definitely one step at a time, one day at a time.
Well,
Liz, are you saying something?
Jewish tradition teaches us to view ourselves as if we are always on the fulcrum between good and evil, and that what really matters most is the very next thing we do.
Barry, there was another dimension of what you said that I think about a lot too. In those moments of trauma, of crisis, back in San Antonio, that time, did you have a sense that no matter what happens, it's all okay?
Yeah, I won't lie and say that, or exaggerate, and say that I felt that way every moment. I mean, while you're in trauma, moments of catastrophizing for sure, and I certainly did. I'm given to that. But because of the, I was early in my Mussar journey at that point. But because of the Mussar training I had already at that point, I was able to like drag myself back and say, this too shall pass. This is going to be okay. I'm gonna, nobody's gonna die here. We're gonna figure out how to have a future.
Mm-hmm.
And even when it was hard to see. And that I was gonna, take steps to do my part to make that work right. I got a coach, I therapist, kind of things that I needed to try to be okay.
My own sense of that personally is that everything that happens gets enfolded into God's life, happy or sad, good or bad, desired or undesired. So it's not that God planned it, but that there's a tapestry that's created by whatever happens, even if it shouldn't have happened. But there's a beauty beyond us that's God's life. And that's, for me, that's the okayness. Doesn't come easily, but I have a sense that even people die. There's a deep okayness.
Right. I agree with that. I agree with that.
Yes, Diane, go ahead.
Hi. Well, so I grew up Episcopalian and then switched to Methodism. And my mother was Methodist growing up, and I have a pretty simple philosophy, which I got from my mother. And my mother was a chronic pain victim. And pretty much what she instilled in us was that God just never gave you more than you could handle, and that you had to trust that he was going to support you through whatever it was that was happening. And and that as things went on, if you may not have, it may not have gone the way you wanted it to go, but that if you looked at it really closely, and this sort of goes to what you were saying, that in the end, it often is pretty good or better than you may have thought it would be in the beginning, but that you just had to trust that in the end, things would work out. So.
But things work, yes, I agree, but things will work out could look very differently from how we imagine things will work out should look.
Yes, and that's pretty much all I have to say.
Oh. We have a comment from Jenny Leslie Berry, and she's saying, I just wanted to say that I really needed to hear this today. I really needed to hear that this too shall pass. Thank you so much, Rabbi Barry Block.
Oh, thank you. That's lovely. I'm grateful that somebody heard what they needed to hear today. That means a lot.
Well, I think many of us heard what we needed to hear today. We are almost at the end of our class, and mostly, actually, normally, always, I end with a poem. But today, while listening to you and thinking about where I find the balance of trust and agency in my life, I would like to close with the story of a woman uh, is who what I think about every time I think of tawakkul and trust, and she is the mother of Prophet Musa, known as Prophet Moses, peace be upon him, in the Western world. And she put her son, her story, I think most of us know because we have different versions of the story, but very similar. But based on our scripture, she put Prophet Moses in a basket in the river at a time when Pharaoh was slaughtering all the male children to protect his power. And what strikes me deeply about the story is the firm trust she had in God. She was not aware of what was going to happen to her child. She did not know the unknown. She did not know God's plan. Nevertheless, she did her part. She placed her beloved son into the basket and watched him floated away out of her sight. And in the end, we know that God did return Prophet Musa back to his mother. And but the key is that she did let go for a moment, for a while, and place her trust in the path where she was placed by God, and she got what was supposed to come her way. And there is such profound wisdom in the story for me, and it helps me think that she did her part and then left the rest to God, putting her trust in God. And it helps, it puts my heart at ease, knowing that what is meant for me will not miss me, and what misses me was never meant for me. And every single encounter or opportunity that we have in this life is an opportunity to make a difference, make a change, and leave the rest to God. So thank you so much, Barry. Thank you so much, Jay, and all of you for being here today. This was a very thought-provoking, thoughtful discussion that we all needed today. We will all see you next week, Wednesday at noon. Peace, salam, and shalom to you all.
What a great blessing to be with all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Block.
My pleasure.